Now, on the last one, I was talking about the ego, and the ego is kind of like tricky to talk about because a lot of people want to say like ego is like, oh, ego is bad, and you have too much ego, you have too much that, like this is a bad thing. What are you doing? But like ego kind of gets like a bad rep. Like the ego is not a bad thing. Like being like egocentric and only seeing yourself within the world and fuck everybody else and the consequences. Okay, that's where it can get bad. But that's not having the ego. That's being egocentric or self-absorbed within your own world. But in like a cult, spiritual, an occult, spiritual, or like religious sense, some religions, it really depends with religion. That's kind of tricky. But with like a cult and like metaphysical and like spiritual principles, the ego, all the ego is yourself. It's not yourself as in your body. It's not yourself as in your emotions or mind and spirituality connected. It's literally just yourself. So if God created us and we're part of God but separate from God, we're like a drop of light from God, right? That drop of light doesn't have the conscious awareness to the degree of humans. It just is a drop of light, right? So that drop of light going into darkness, that's where we come into play as a ego, because the drop of light always feels connected to God. But when it goes into the darkness then molds or marries or encapsulates or tries to hold the light. And when the light and darkness come together, then they form a new substance. That new substance is the awareness of something else. So the awareness of something else to the drop of light is foreign, right? It's opposite of it. So you could say the drop of light is God and the darkness that's consuming it is the devil. Like that's kind of like the thought process we're going with it. And it's going to make more sense a little bit later. So with the devil trying to consume the light and the light just trying to shine, them both coming together is what's going to create a new substance. That new substance is the awareness of something new. That awareness of something new is our ego. Like that's the alchemical process of our ego. Our ego is divine, but it's also of the lower nature too. It's both, because our highest ego is one with God already. It's the part of light that's already light, that's always been light and only knows light. But we don't always know light. Sometimes we get to spiritual ecstasy where we feel that pure light, but we don't hold that frequency continuously. So not holding that spiritual frequency continuously makes us children of the darkness, right? But we're also children of the light. But we're not one or the other. We're both. We're both masculine and we're both feminine. We're both God and we're the devil. We're both angels and we're both demons. And it's our job for our ego, right, to take control of itself. To be like, hey, everything stop. We're all good. And then slowly piece out every bit of light into the darkness and map out the darkness. Once you're able to map out the darkness, it's known, so it's no longer dark. It gets transmuted to light. And once it gets transmuted to light, it's no longer darkness, it turns to light. And eventually it gets to the point where the light and darkness realizes that they're one and the same thing. And then the light and the darkness become one, and it becomes invisible. It just goes to another dimension, another dimension of life, right? Because now you got both sides that are not trying to rule each other. Now they're living in harmony. But the life of the light and darkness living in harmony isn't the same of the life of the lightness and dark combating for superiority. So like that kind of goes into like the human experience. But back to the ego. Our ego descends upon us at a certain time of our life, and like psychology, they'll let you know like at this age this is happening, at this age this is happening, and at this age this is happening. But the ego doesn't descend upon you until you're ready. Like Some people's ego may come to them at a very young age. Other people's ego might not come to them later in life. Like for instance, my ego didn't come to me until I was 19, but other people's ego may have come to them when they're 12. You know what I'm saying? It's just your life experiences and where you are in life when the ego decides to descend because you're ready for it. Now, this is not the ego of the self-centered person. This is the ego that says, "Hey, this is the right thing to do," or "Hey, this is the wrong thing to do." This is the ego that guides you. This is not the ego like I'm the only one that matters. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the spiritual ego, and this ego is what helps drive you and comforts you and pushes you to the next level and continuously challenges you, and then it comforts you, and then sometimes it feels like it disappears and then it's not there at all, and you're trying to make the decisions on your own but you're not really sure. But that is the ego playing out itself within yourself, because when the ego descends upon you, it's like a whole nother voice in your mind. But then over time the ego integrates with yourself, with your lower self, and that ego takes your lower self, like that part that has you specifically, and it integrates itself with itself, and it's like, okay, now we're together. So it's basically like this: your highest self, right, in its lowest form. So everybody talks about the higher self and things like that. Well, think about this. Think about your highest self in its lowest form. We'll call that the ego. And then think about your highest self. Think about your lowest self in the highest form, right? That's the part that touches the ego. And eventually they marry. And eventually the lowest self of the highest and the highest of the lowest become one. And then you're able to be in control of your lower ego. And your lower ego is the one that most of us use throughout the day to day. Is the one that, this is what I should do today, this is what I shouldn't do today, this is what I feel like doing, this is what I don't feel like doing, this is how I'm gonna interact with things, this is how I feel about things. That's the ego. That lower ego is what's processing everything. But the thing about it is that ego is just one part of its full nature. And once you get deeper into that ego, everything you do in this life, you're programming it, right? You're programming it from a lower nature standpoint into things that may not benefit you in the long run. But with the whole scheme of spirituality and with outside the time loop, everything that you do is an experience upon your ego to carry into the next life. Because this consciousness that we have that has your name on it, this consciousness may not survive in totality into the next life because it's not needed. It just needed some experiences that you experienced, but then the ego draws back to its main body and takes those experiences and then reincarnates to try to manifest its full potential. Now, with that said, it'll go into like what I call like the apparechi, and how like you take this consciousness and you go to the next world and live into the next consciousness and going like that. But that's where I'm trying to get to eventually to start talking about. But first I have to go through like the foundations of things. So I'm gonna take a drink of this real quick. So when we're programming our ego, eventually we get to the point to where, okay, enough is enough. I want things to go this way, and you start organizing yourself and organizing your mind to start thinking a certain way that causes you to start doing things a certain way. And you start lifting those spiritual muscles in order to continue to have discipline within yourself, to keep the motivation up, to keep seeing the progress. Now, here's where we get trapped in the ego, because the ego, you have to remember, It's your lower nature and higher nature converging on itself. So just like the light from God and the darkness, at first they're they're fighting. In a sense, they're fighting for superiority. Like, I'm me, and the darkness says, no, I'm me. But the light can only be the light, and darkness can only be the darkness. It doesn't understand that they're the same thing. So they're fighting each other. The darkness is trying to take the light and snuff it. The light is trying to take the darkness and change it. So you have this force within yourself, within your consciousness, that's continuously fighting, and it's the ego's job to reconcile that. But sometimes, especially in our society, our lower natures are always winning because we don't have the necessary tools to rise above in each situation so that the higher forces can take control of the lower forces. And I'm not gonna be nihilistic and say it's built like that, but sometimes it feels like that. But on the same token, when we're talking about the brotherhoods, well, of the brotherhoods of light and brotherhood of darkness, they may have put it like that on purpose. And I'll talk about the brotherhood and my understanding of that later. So we have to fight our lower nature, our lower self, in order to get to the higher self. But how we fight our lower selves is going to determine how much of the light of the higher self we can obtain. Because in one instance, if we keep making ourselves better at the expense of ourselves, then we're not going to feel good about it. And what I mean by that is like forcing ourselves to do things that we don't want to do in order to be better. And that may seem like, duh, that's what you're supposed to do. But if you think about the karma we're putting on ourselves, we're forcing ourselves to not do one thing, right? So we're saying, no, we're not doing that thing, we're doing this. And we're forcing ourselves, whether we want to do it or not, to do this thing. Well, you may get progress and the things you need out of that, but you're also feeling something too. You're feeling like, damn, I really want to do that, but I can't. And then eventually, you wouldn't want to do it at all. But then one day you'll fall off, and then you'll do that thing, but then you'll overdo it because you haven't exercised that desire out. What you just did was you just snuffed it out the way. You just pushed it out the way. But it's like in the Bible, when Jesus was talking to, I forgot who he was talking to, but he said, I feel bad for the next generations because they'll cast out demons and then the demons will come back sevenfold. Well, the demons are coming back sevenfold is because we're trying to fight them instead of understanding them. We're trying to say, I don't want to do this addiction anymore, rather than saying, why am I doing this addiction? You see what I'm saying? Because the purpose in this life of the ego isn't to make itself better at any cost. It's to understand why we do the things that we do. Like, it's not just to make a lot of money, have a family, and die. It's to understand the value of things on this earth and the time that we're living in, to see where we're lacking within ourselves and show us our flaws so we can work on our flaws. And when we're working on our flaws, we're working on a certain frequency within the third dimension. And the more we work on those flaws within the third dimension, and we exercise them properly, and instead of pushing them aside, we exercise the desire, we understand the desire, we make it easier for people that tap into that frequency to want to do better within that frequency pocket or that frequency world, so they can do better and it'll be easier for them. It's kind of like having a drinking addiction, right? You drink every day for 10 years, right? Super bad habit, right? But then eventually one day you're like, I don't want to do this anymore. So then, let's say you go to rehab, you go to all these AA classes, you do all these things to eventually get to the point to where you're questioning yourself, man, why am I doing this, right? Like, I'm hurting these people, I'm hurting myself. And then you years and years later, you get to the point of falling off, getting back on, falling off, getting back on, so you get to the point to where you genuinely feel within inside yourself, you do not want to do this anymore. Like, you have exhausted the fire for that You've exhausted the fire for that addiction, and you just don't want to do it anymore. And at that point, you cannot fall off again. At that point, you could do it, and you could like dislike it, like the whole time you're doing it, like, ew, I can't believe I did that. I'm disgusted with myself, and then keep on moving with your life. And when you do that, it makes it easier spiritually through the frequencies, through the energetic structure of our third dimensional framework. It makes it easier for the next person to do that. So think about it. Think about the first person that discovered alcohol that was a drunkard, right? Think about how hard it was for them to quit if they could. Because you gotta remember, without spiritual things happening continuously, it's hard for us to experience those things. Just like for instance, you can't raise the dead just all willy-nilly, you know what I'm saying? Like you have to have a certain spiritual understanding in order to do that. Do you see what I'm saying? And I'm not saying whether you're raising someone physically from the dead or you're resurrecting someone's mental thoughts within their mind to start thinking in the light, whichever one you're thinking about. You can't just willy-nilly do that. You have to do it. You have to have a certain type of understanding of life and yourself and how your ego interacts with all of those things, and extract that knowledge from the higher ego in order to be able to do that. It's the same thing with anything in life. The more we fight the good fight, and the more we progress, and the more we get to higher things, and we're extinguish the desires below us, and we understand them, and they're no longer a hindrance for us, then we become helpers of humanity. And it's not necessarily helpers of humanity where you're talking to someone helping them out. It's helpers of humanity through the ether. Like you're opening that gap within the space-time continuum, allowing that frequency of healing to come in. And it's not just healing of I don't want to do it anymore. It's the healing of the process of doing it, of getting over that desire in a complete fashion. So in your next life, you don't even have that addiction. Like that addiction in your next life isn't a thing because you've exercised it in this life. So I'm kind of wrap this up. So with the ego, right? Now, this is what I believe, and you don't have to believe this, but I kind of want to say this because it will make more sense when I start talking about it later. To me, the ego is a soul. It's the soul of man, right? To me. But the higher form of the ego is the divine ego, right? Which is the okay, hold on. I kind of said that wrong. So like the ego of the man, right? Which is like the everyday ego that we use, which is our lower and higher self fighting each other, right? That is fighting for entrance into the soul, which is the divine ego. The divine ego or the soul is God. It's your personal God, right? Because like let's say there's an overall God for everybody, right? Well, the God for you is your soul. It's the light. It's Amun Ra. It's the sun in the sky. That sun in the sky, you also have a sun within yourself. That sun within yourself is your soul. That soul is your God. Like that's your God. That holds everything that you are from all the lifetimes of eternity, right? What our job is to get our lower ego up to the divine ego, so that soul, that God, becomes our ego, right? And when that soul becomes our ego, then that soul becomes our body. Just like our physical body is our physical body, that soul becomes our body. And then when that soul becomes our body, then we get to the next stage of evolution, which I believe is being married with the spirit. So the soul becoming one with the spirit. So just like we have emotions, we have a physical body, emotional body, and then a mental body. Well, on one octave up, we have, instead of the physical body, we have the emotional body replacing it. And then after the emotional body, you have the mental body. Then after the mental body, you have the solar body. So the solar body takes the place of the mind, and then the mental body takes the place of the emotional body. So then on another octave, you have the emotional body done away with completely because it's done. Now instead of the emotional body, you have the mental body. And then instead of the mental body, and what takes the place of the mental body is the solar body. And then what takes the place of the solar body is the spiritual body. So at the top, you have the spiritual body, right? The spiritual frequency. Then within the spiritual frequency, you have the solar frequency, and then within the solar frequency, you have the mental frequency, and that mental frequency is the higher bodies, right? So I don't know. I'm about to speculate right here, but eventually you're gonna do away with the mental body too. Like the mental body is for a specific purpose. Just like the physical body was for a purpose, the emotional body was for a purpose. Well, the mental body is going to be for a purpose, and then eventually your mental body is going to turn in and be replaced by the solar body. Then the solar body is going to be within the spiritual body. And then the spiritual body is going to be within another body that's unknown to us, and it's going to keep doing that over and over and over and over and over again. And it may be the fact that our physical body doesn't actually go anywhere. It just transforms into the emotional body. It just transforms into the mental body. It just transforms into the solar body. It transforms into the spiritual body. And then when you hit that spiritual point, and now you've done your lower initiations, now that spiritual body becomes a physical body. Right? So now you're on a higher octave of the physical planes, right? That's where we come up with the concepts of like Arcturians, or the beings that like the Draconians, like all those other alien beings that we're thinking of. That's what octave that we're thinking of them on. We're thinking of them as completely enlightened spiritual entities, but they're on the physical level. So instead of them being on the third dimensional frequencies within the third, instead of them being on the third dimensional frequencies of the third dimension, they're in the third dimensional frequencies of the fourth dimension, right? It will make more sense the further and further I get into these things. But wrapping up the ego is a tool that we need, and we're not supposed to kill it in the sense of what the Bible says. The Bible, you have to really understand the words that they're using in the Bible and what they're meaning, because they're not saying kill the ego. They're saying in principle that the ego that you have isn't pure, so you need to purify it. But back then they used to sacrifice things for purification. So you have to like understand these concepts. But the ego is using the mind in order to direct itself into the places it needs to go, so it can channel the right energy, so it could diffuse the lower desires and make sense of them, so it can add that to the soul and give it as offering, so the understanding reaches the etheric field to make others able to come through that etheric field with less resistance, so it can get to the next level. So once the ego gets to the higher ego, then you're able to experience life on a higher frequency and start doing different things psychically. And this process isn't a process that takes like a lifetime. This takes like a long time, like countless lives. But we're at a point in our time now, we say it's like 2024, but in actuality it's like year 1,700,000. You know, like we're far along the path of our evolution within this Earth race scheme. So we're further along than we think, and we're able to use that knowledge that we have now, that people have been struggling for eons, technically. We're able to use that energy and bring it all in. The problem is that there's so much information and it's so new to us that it's overloading us, and we don't know how to decipher it yet because we haven't built up the chops for it. So it's going to be a time period where we're getting a lot of information, but it's going to be at that time period that we're in now where we don't know how to decipher the information. So now we're just going to be collecting information until the younger generations come up and they're able to understand the multiplicities of life within the etheric field, and bring that knowledge back down in order to separate things intellectually, to be able to spread it to the masses in their different points of where they are, so they can talk to them in their degrees, to eventually lift the human race out of the lower darkness into a higher darkness, so they can be closer to the light, so they can understand these things.